Hey there, deep diver. Ready to dive into something that's super important for a smooth web experience.
Absolutely.
We're talking asynchronous JavaScript. You know, the stuff that keeps web pages like snappy and responsive. No one likes waiting for ages for a page to load, right?
Definitely not.
And, you've actually given us some really cool resources to help us with this deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, including like a whole podcast episode
Wow.
dedicated to this very topic.
Okay, so we've got plenty to work with then.
We do. So imagine, right? You're a chef.
Yeah.
You're in a busy kitchen.
Lots of things going on.
Exactly. You're juggling tons of tasks at the same time. That's
Mhm.
kind of like what JavaScript has to do on a web page. It's got to handle like user interactions, fetching data, animations, all this stuff without everything grinding to a halt.
Right.
And to pull off this juggling act, JavaScript uses some pretty awesome tools. We'll be focusing on three main ones in this deep dive.
Okay, lay it on me.
Callbacks, promises, and the star of the show, async await.
Sounds good.
But before we get into the specifics, let's take a step back and look at the fundamental difference between synchronous and asynchronous JavaScript.
You know, it's kind of like waiting in line.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever been somewhere where everyone has to wait in a single line and you can't move forward until the person in front of you is done?
Yeah, I've definitely been in those lines.
That's kind of like synchronous JavaScript. One task has to finish completely before the next one can even begin.
Makes sense. But I feel like the web doesn't really work that way, right?
Not at all. I mean, imagine if everything on a web page had to happen in a strict one after the other order.
Yeah.
Any long operation, like fetching a large image or something, would just freeze the whole page. And that's where asynchronous JavaScript comes in.
Okay, so it's not like that single line anymore.
Nope, not at all.
Yeah.
Think of it more like taking a number at the deli counter. You get your number, and then you can chill, maybe browse around a bit until your number is called.
Ah, I like that analogy. So instead of waiting for a task to finish, asynchronous JavaScript allows the program to keep running other tasks in the meantime.
Exactly. And that's what keeps web pages responsive, even when they're dealing with lots of data or complex operations.
Okay, so it's more of a like grab a coffee and browse while you wait kind of vibe.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where our first tool, Callbacks, comes in,
Yeah.
right?
Callbacks were like the original way to handle these asynchronous tasks in JavaScript. They're basically functions that you pass as arguments to other functions. When the asynchronous operation finishes, it triggers that callback function.
So it's like leaving a note saying, call me back when you're done with that thing.
Yeah, exactly like that.
Yeah.
So let's say you're fetching data from a server, which can take some time.
Mm-hmm.
A callback function lets you do something with that data once it arrives without blocking the rest of the page from working in the meantime.
That makes sense. But I've heard some horror stories about something called callback hell.
Oh, callback hell? Yeah.
What's that all about?
Callback hell is what happens when you have a bunch of asynchronous tasks and they all depend on each other.
Okay.
You end up with all these nested callbacks, like one callback triggers another, which triggers another, and so on. And then it becomes a real pain to read the code and figure out what's going on.
Sounds messy.
It can get pretty messy, yeah,
So that's why developers started looking for alternatives to callbacks, right?
for sure. And that's where promises came in.
Promises.
Promises offered a more structured and organized way to deal with asynchronous operations.
Promises sound much more reassuring than callback hell.
They do, don't they?
So tell me more about how they work.
Well, a promise basically represents the eventual outcome of an asynchronous task. It can be in one of three states: pending, fulfilled, or rejected.
So it's kind of like a digital pinky swear, like something will eventually happen and you'll know whether it succeeded or failed.
Exactly. So let's imagine you're making an API request. When you initiate the request, the promise is in a pending state. If the request is successful, the promise gets fulfilled and you get the data. But if there's an error, the promise gets rejected and you get information about what went wrong.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get this. So how do we actually use promises in our code?
Promises rely on two main methods, that then and .catch.
Okay.
You can use .then to specify what should happen when the promise is fulfilled, like processing the data you got from the API request.
Gotcha.
And .catch, well, that lets you handle any errors that might occur.
So it's like setting up a plan for both success and failure.
That's a great way to put it. And, you know, one of the cool things about promises is that you can chain them together.
What do you mean by that?
You can say, do this asynchronous task, then when it's finished, do this other task, then do this.
So it's like a very organized way to manage a whole series of asynchronous operations.
Precisely. Promises definitely brought some much-needed structure to asynchronous JavaScript.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? JavaScript didn't stop there.
What else is there?
It introduced an even more powerful tool, Async Await.
Ooh, Async await. I've heard about this. This is like the superhero of asynchronous JavaScript, right?
You could say that. Async Await builds on top of promises, but it makes your code look and feel much more like synchronous code.
Oh, interesting. So it's easier to read and understand.
Exactly.
Okay, you've got my attention. Can you give me like a quick rundown of how Async await works?
Sure. So to use Async Await, you first define a function as async. Inside that function, you can use the keyword await before promise.
So we're basically saying pause here until this promise is resolved.
You got it. The code will wait for the promise to either fulfill or reject, and then it will continue executing like it was a regular synchronous function call.
Wow, that sounds incredibly powerful. Does this mean we don't need promises anymore?
Not quite.
Yeah.
Async Await actually still relies on promises under the hood. It's more like a more elegant way to work with them. Makes your code much more readable.
So it's like syntactic sugar.
Exactly. We'll dive deeper into the nuances of Async Await later in this deep dive.
Okay, looking forward to it. Can we quickly recap what we've covered so far?
Sure, absolutely. We started by talking about the core concepts of asynchronous JavaScript.
Right, the difference between synchronous and asynchronous operations.
Exactly. Then we explored the initial solution, callbacks, and how they can lead to callback hell when dealing with multiple asynchronous tasks.
Oh yeah, that was a fun one.
Then we talked about promises, which offer a more structured approach, with their 3 states, pending, fulfilled, and rejected. We learned about chaining promises to manage a sequence of tasks and how to handle errors gracefully.
That's a great summary. So what's next?
Well, now I'm excited to tell you more about this magical Async Await and how it can really simplify our asynchronous adventures.
Yeah, let's get into that.
Sounds good. Welcome back. Now that we have a good understanding of asynchronous JavaScript
Yeah.
and how it helps create a smoother web experience, let's shift gears a bit and dive into another really important aspect of modern JavaScript development, modules.
Modules, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, from what I understand, modules are all about like bringing order to our code, especially when we're dealing with large, complex projects.
Exactly. As our JavaScript applications grow, managing all that code, it can get really challenging. Like imagine you're building a skyscraper
Okay, yeah.
and you're using a single massive blueprint. It would be like a nightmare trying to keep track of everything.
Oh, for sure. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It would be. And that's where modules come in.
Okay.
Modules let us break down our code in smaller self-contained units,
Okay.
each with a specific purpose.
Yeah.
It's kind of like having separate blueprints for different parts of the skyscraper.
I see, I see. So modules act as those individual blueprints, making the whole project much more organized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But how do we actually create and use these modules in JavaScript?
Yeah, that's a good question. How do we do that?
Well, you know what? JavaScript didn't always have built-in support for modules.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in the past, developers would use all sorts of workarounds and libraries
Okay.
just to like achieve modularity. But then along came ES6.
ES6. Yeah, that rings a bell. That's like a supercharged version of JavaScript?
It is. ES6 brought a ton of new features and improvements, including the much-needed module system.
Okay, so how do these ES6 modules work in practice?
Let's say you have a file, we'll call it module1.js,
Okay.
and it has some useful functions. You want to use these functions in another file, maybe main.js.
Got it.
With ES6 modules, you can use the export keyword in module1.js, and that makes those functions accessible to other modules.
So export is kind of like putting those functions on display, ready to be used elsewhere.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. And then in your main.js file, you use the import keyword to bring in the specific functions you need from module1.js. It's a super clean and organized way to share code between different parts of your application.
This sounds like a much better approach than having one giant file with all your code crammed together. But, I mean, what are the real advantages of using modules?
Well, for starters, modules make your code way more organized
Okay.
and easier to read.
Right.
Instead of this huge monolithic file, you have these smaller, more focused files
Okay, yeah.
that are just easier to understand
Yeah.
and maintain.
It's kind of like tidying up a messy room.
Right?
Everything has its place, and it's so much easier to find what you need.
Exactly. And that improved organization makes collaboration a lot smoother, too. Different developers can work on separate modules without stepping on each other's toes.
Yeah, I bet that reduces the chances of like accidentally creating conflicts in the code.
Exactly. Less chance of breaking things. What else? Oh, modules also encourage code reusability. So once you create a module for a specific functionality, you can easily reuse it in
Ah.
other projects or in different parts of your application.
So it's like having a library of ready-made solutions for common tasks.
That's it. And finally, modules are essential for managing dependencies between the different parts of our code.
Dependencies. Can you explain that a little more?
So think of it like this. Some modules, they might rely on functionality provided by other modules.
Okay.
For example, let's say you have a module that handles user authentication. That module might depend on another module that's responsible for making network requests.
So it's like a chain of interconnected components.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And modules let us define these dependencies in a very clear way, making it obvious which modules need to be loaded first. This makes sure that our code runs in the correct order.
This is all starting to make a lot of sense. But are all JavaScript modules created equal? Or are there different types we should know about?
That's a great question. While ES6 modules are kind of the standard now, you might still run into other module formats, especially in older code bases.
Oh, okay.
A common one is Comma.js that was widely used before ES6 came along. It's kind of like different dialects of the same language, I guess.
Okay, so they all essentially do the same thing. They just have their own little quirks.
That's a good way to put it. The key takeaway here is that modules, no matter the specific format, they're super important for building scalable and maintainable JavaScript applications.
I see. So this whole modular approach, it's like taking our JavaScript skills to the next level. But are there any like downsides or challenges we should be aware of when working with modules?
Of course, modules bring a lot of advantages.
Right.
But there are a few things to watch out for. One common pitfall is what we call circular dependencies.
Circular dependencies. That sounds a bit tangled.
It can be, yeah.
Okay.
It happens when Module A depends on Module B, but then Module B also depends on Module A. Creates this loop. That can cause all sorts of problems.
So it's like two gears trying to interlock.
Yes, and they just end up stuck. We need to be careful about how modules depend on each other and structure our code to avoid these circular situations.
Gotcha. Any other potential challenges?
Well, sometimes managing those dependencies, it can get a bit complex, especially in larger projects with lots of interconnected modules. But luckily, we have tools, package managers like NPM and Yarn. They can help streamline this whole process.
Package managers. What are those?
Think of them like librarians for our code.
Okay.
They help us find, install, and manage external libraries and modules
Got it.
that our projects depend on.
So it's like having this huge catalog of pre-built components.
Yeah, exactly. They handle downloading those components, installing them, and keeping them updated. Gives us more time to focus on writing the core logic of our applications.
I like the sound of that. So with all this talk about modules, can we do a quick recap of the key points before we move on?
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of ground today. Modules, as we've learned, help us break down our code into these smaller, reusable units. This makes our code base more organized, readable, and easier to maintain.
And we talked about those keywords, export and import.
Right. Those are the keywords that let us share code between modules.
Yeah. And how that creates a clear structure for applications.
We also discussed the many benefits of modularity. Improved collaboration, increased code reusability, and easier dependency management. Not to mention we touched on some potential challenges, like those circular dependencies and managing those dependencies in those big projects, and how tools like NPM and Yarn can really come to the rescue.
Yeah, it's been really insightful. So before we wrap up, I want to pose a question to you, our listener. Imagine a complex software application that you use every day, like your favorite social media platform, or a really sophisticated online game.
Okay.
Can you imagine how much harder it would be to develop and maintain those applications without these principles of modularity?
Oh, yeah.
Something to think about. Our journey doesn't end here, though. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore the world of JavaScript build tools and task runners.
Oh, those are fun.
Revealing how they can streamline our development workflow even further and automate those repetitive tasks that can really bog us down. Get ready to supercharge your JavaScript development process.
All right, welcome back to the show. We've been exploring a lot in our JavaScript deep dive, haven't we?
We have.
We talked about the complexities of asynchronous JavaScript, how to use modules to organize our code. Now, I'm really excited to uncover the tools that can, help streamline our development process, build tools and task runners.
Yeah, those are game changers for sure. Think of them like the stage crew in a theater production. They're not in the spotlight,
Right.
but they make sure everything runs smoothly behind the scenes.
And in the world of JavaScript development, well, they handle all those tasks like minifying code, bundling files, transpiling, testing, all those things that we need, but they can be time-consuming, frees us up to focus on writing great code.
Okay, I'm starting to see the appeal here, but can we break it down a little bit? Like, what are build tools and task runners exactly?
A build tool, basically, it takes your raw source code and transforms it into a format that's ready for production, kind of like a chef, right?
Yeah.
Takes those raw ingredients and turns them into a delicious meal, a beautifully plated dish. That's what a build tool does for your code.
So what sorts of transformations are we talking about here? What do they actually do?
One common task is code minification, which is basically removing all the unnecessary stuff. Characters, white space, comments, all that. Makes those files smaller.
Ah, so they download faster.
Right. Leads to a better user experience.
So it's kind of like packing a suitcase efficiently, getting rid of the extra bulk to make it easier to carry.
That's it. Another important task is bundling. Modern JavaScript applications, they often have like tons of separate files, modules. Bundling takes all those files, combines them into a single package. This way, the browser doesn't have to make a bunch of separate requests.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So faster page loads.
Exactly. And then there's transpiling. Have you heard of transpiling?
I have, but I'm not sure I totally get what it means.
Transpiling, basically, it's like converting code from one language or syntax to another. In JavaScript, it's often used to convert newer JavaScript features into code that older browsers can understand, so more people can use your app.
Oh, that's really smart. So everyone has access, no matter what browser they're using. It's like a universal translator.
Exactly. And beyond all that, build tools can also run tests, check your code for errors, even deploy your application to a server.
So they really are multitaskers.
Yeah.
What are some popular build tools that people use?
There are a few big ones out there.
Yeah.
Webpack, Parcel, Rollup. Each has its strengths and weaknesses. But the goal is the same. Automate that development process. Streamline things.
Okay. And what about task runners? Are they similar to build tools?
They are, in that they automate tasks. But task runners, like Gulp and Grunt, they're more general purpose. You can use them for a wider range of tasks, not just building the application.
So they're kind of like the really helpful people who are always willing to lend a hand, no matter what the task is.
Yeah, exactly. You can use them to optimize images, pre-process CSS, even run custom scripts, whatever you need.
All right, so I'm starting to get the picture here. How do we actually use these build tools and task runners?
Well, most of them, they use a configuration file. You define the tasks that you want to automate, the files you want to process, the desired output. It's kind of like giving instructions to your automated assistant.
Okay, like a to-do list.
That's it. Then you run it from your command line, and it goes off and does all those tasks for you.
This is pretty impressive, but I bet there's a bit of a learning curve, right?
Oh, definitely. Like any powerful tool, it takes some time to learn how to use it effectively. But once you've got it set up and all those repetitive tasks are automated, you get so much time back. Focus on the more fun stuff.
I can see how that would be really valuable. Are there any pitfalls or things to watch out for when using these tools?
Yeah, one thing to be mindful of is over-engineering. It's easy to get carried away trying to automate everything. Sometimes it's better to keep things simple, you know?
Yeah.
You don't want your build process to become this huge, complicated thing.
Yeah.
That's hard to understand.
Right, too many cooks in the kitchen kind of thing.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance. How much automation do you really need?
Well, this has been really fascinating. We've learned a lot about build tools and task runners, essential tools for any JavaScript developer, I'd say.
For sure.
They might not be glamorous, but they make our lives a lot easier, handling all those behind-the-scenes tasks.
Absolutely.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the world of JavaScript. We started with the basics.
Yeah, synchronous versus asynchronous code.
Right. Explored how callbacks, promises, and async await help us manage those asynchronous operations.
Learned how to organize our code with modules. Use build tools and task runners to automate all those tedious tasks.
It's been a journey, And I hope you've learned some valuable things along the way. As you continue to explore the world of web development, remember that JavaScript is a constantly evolving language. There are always new tools and techniques to learn. Keep experimenting, keep learning, and most importantly, keep building amazing things. Until next time, happy